Hello friends, so on we go from page 98 to 108 of Daniel Defoe's A Journal of the Plague Year. There's some real horrors in store, maybe so horrible that they might require a trigger warning. I don't really know how trigger warnings work. There is a brief mention made of hanging. There's also a very lengthy and detailed account of the theft of women's hats. I'm afraid at this point society seems to be breaking down a little bit, and it does seem to be women who are mainly responsible for that. I'm sorry about that. And in fact, the narrator says more of them should be hanged. But there's also a funny anecdote to round off with. So enjoy. All the very best. Bye-bye. No, hang on, I haven't started reading yet. Right. But though I confined my family, I could not prevail upon my unsatisfied curiosity to stay within entirely myself, and though I generally came frighted and terrified home, yet I could not restrain, only that indeed I did not do it so frequently as at first. I had some little obligations indeed upon me to go to my brother's house, which was in Coleman Street parish, and which he had left to my care, and I went at first every day, but afterwards only once or twice a week. In these walks I had many dismal scenes before my eyes, as particularly of persons falling dead in the streets, terrible shrieks and screechings of women who in their agonies would throw open their chamber windows and cry out in a dismal, surprising manner. It is impossible to describe the variety of postures in which the passions of the poor people would express themselves. Passing through Token House Yard in Lothbury, of a sudden a casement violently opened and just over my head, and a woman gave 3 dreadful screeches and then cried, "Oh, death, death, death!" in a most inimitable tone, and which struck me with horror and chillness in my very blood. There was nobody to be seen in the whole street, neither did any other window open, for people had no curiosity now in any case, nor could anybody help one another. So I went on to pass into Bell Alley. Just in Bell Alley, on the right hand of the passage, there was a more terrible cry than that, though it was not so directed out at the window, but the whole family was in a terrible fright, and I could hear women and children run, screaming about the rooms like distracted, when a garret window opened and somebody from a window on the other side the alley called and asked, "What is the matter?" Upon which, from the first window, it was answered, "Oh, Lord, my old master has hanged himself." The other asked again, "Is he quite dead?" And the first answered, "Aye, aye, quite dead and cold." This person was a merchant and a deputy alderman, and very rich. I care not to mention the name, although I knew his name too, but that would be an hardship to the family, which is now flourishing again. But this is but one. It is scarce credible what dreadful cases happened in particular families every day. People in the rage of the distemper, or in the torment of their swellings, which was indeed intolerable, running out of their own government, editor's note, capacity for self-control, raving and distracted, and oftentimes laying violent hands upon themselves, throwing themselves out at their windows, shooting themselves, etc. Mothers murdering their own children in their lunacy, some dying of mere grief as a passion, some of mere fright and surprise without any infection at all, others frighted into idiotism and foolish distractions, some into despair and lunacy, others into melancholy madness. The pain of the swelling was in particular very violent, and to some intolerable. The physicians and surgeons may be said to have tortured many poor creatures even to death. The swellings in some grew hard, and they applied violent drawing plasters or poultices to break them, and if these did not do, they cut and sacrificed them in a terrible manner. In some those swellings were made hard partly by the force of the distemper, and partly by their being too violently drawn, and were so hard that no instrument could cut them. And then they burnt them with caustics, so that many died raving mad with the torment, and some in the very operation. In these distresses, some, for want of help to hold them down to their beds or to look to them, laid hands upon themselves, as above. Some broke out into the streets, perhaps naked, and would run directly down to the river if they were not stopped by the watchman or other officers, and plunge themselves into the water wherever they found it. It often pierced my very soul to hear the groans and cries of those who were thus tormented. But of the two this was counted the most promising particular in the whole infection, for if these swellings could be brought to a head, and to break and run, or as the surgeons called it, to digest, the patient generally recovered, whereas those who, like the gentlewoman's daughter, were struck with death at the beginning, and had the tokens come out upon them, often went about indifferent easy till a little before they died, and some till the moment they dropped down, as in apoplexies and epilepsies is often the case. Such would be taken suddenly very sick, and would run to a bench or bulk or any convenient place that offered itself, or to their own houses if possible, as I mentioned before, and there sit down, grow faint, and die. This kind of dying was much the same as it was with those who die of common mortifications, who die swooning and, as it were, go away in a dream. Such as died thus had very little notice of their being infected at all till the gangrene was spread through their whole body, nor could physicians themselves know certainly how it was with them till they opened their breasts or other parts of their body and saw the tokens. We had at this time a great many frightful stories told us of nurses and watchmen who looked after the dying people, that is to say, hired nurses who attended infected people, using them barbarously, starving them, smothering them, or by other wicked means hastening their end, that is to say, murdering of them. And watchmen being set to guard houses that were shut up when there has been but one person left, and perhaps that one lying sick, that they have broke in and murdered that body, and immediately thrown them out into the dead cart, and so they have gone scarce cold to their grave. I cannot say but that some such murders were committed, and I think 2 were sent to prison for it, but died before they could be tried, and I've heard that 3 others at several times were excused for murders of that kind, but I must say I believe nothing of its being so common a crime as some have since pleased to say, nor did it seem to be so rational where the people were brought so low as not to be able to help themselves, for such seldom recovered, and there was no temptation to commit a murder, at least none equal to the fact, where they were sure persons would die in so short a time and could not live. That there were a great many robberies and wicked practices committed even in this dreadful time, I do not deny. The power of avarice was so strong in some that they would run any hazard to steal and to plunder, and particularly in houses where all the families or inhabitants had been dead and carried out, they would break in at all hazards, and without regard to the danger of infection take even the clothes off the dead bodies and the bedclothes from others where they lay dead. This, I suppose, must be the case of a family in Houndsditch, where a man and his daughter, the rest of the family being, as I suppose, carried away before by the dead cart, were found stark naked, one in one chamber and one in another, lying dead on the floor, and the clothes of the beds, from whence 'tis supposed they were rolled off by thieves, stolen and carried away. It is indeed to be observed that the women were in all this calamity the most rash, fearless, and desperate creatures, and as there were vast numbers that went about as nurses to tend those that were sick, they committed a great many petty thieveries in the houses where they were employed, and some of them were publicly whipped for it, when, perhaps, they ought rather to have been hanged for examples, for numbers of houses were robbed on these occasions, till at length the parish officers were sent to recommend nurses to the sick, and always took an account whom it was they sent, so as that they might call them to account if the house had been abused where they were placed. But these robberies extended chiefly to the wearing clothes, linen, and what rings or money they could come at when the person died who was under their care, but not to a general plunder of the houses. And I could give you an account of one of these nurses, who, several years after, being on her deathbed, confessed with the utmost horror the robberies she had committed at the time of her being a nurse, and by which she had enriched herself to a great degree. But as for murders, I do not find that there was ever any proof of the facts in the manner as it has been reported, except as above. They did tell me, indeed, of a nurse in one place that laid a wet cloth upon the face of a dying patient whom she tended, and so put an end to his life, who was just expiring before, and another that smothered a young woman she was looking to when she was in a fainting fit and would have come to herself, some that killed them by giving them one thing, some another, and some starved them by giving them nothing at all. But these stories had 2 marks of suspicion that always attended them, which caused me always to slight them and to look on them as mere stories that people continually frighted one another with. First, that wherever it was that we heard it, they always placed the scene at the farther end of the town, opposite or most remote from where you were to hear it. If you heard it in Whitechapel, it had happened at St. Giles or at Westminster or Holborn or the end of the town. If you heard it at that end of the town, then it was done in Whitechapel or the Minories or about Cripplegate parish. If you heard of it in the city, why then it happened in Southwark, and if you heard of it in Southwark, then it was done in the city, and the like. In the next place, of what part soever you heard the story, the particulars were always the same, especially that of laying a wet double clout on a dying man's face, and that of smothering a young gentlewoman, so that it was apparent, at least to my judgment, that there was more of tale than of truth in those things. However, I cannot say but it had some effect upon the people, and particularly that, as I said before, they grew more cautious whom they took into their houses, and whom they trusted their lives with, and had them always recommended if they could, and where they could not find such, for they were not very plenty, they applied to the parish officers. But here again the misery of that time lay upon the poor, who being infected had neither food or physic, neither physician or apothecary to assist them, or nurse to attend them. Many of those died calling for help, or even for sustenance, out of their windows in a most miserable and deplorable manner. But it must be added that whenever the cases of such persons or families were represented to my Lord Mayor, they always were relieved. It is true in some houses where people were not very poor, yet where they had sent perhaps their wives and children away, and if they had any servants they had been dismissed. I say, it is true that to save the expenses, many such as these shut themselves in, and, not having help, died alone. A neighbour and acquaintance of mine, having some money owing to him from a shopkeeper in Whitecross Street or thereabouts, sent his apprentice, a youth about 18 years of age, to endeavour to get the money. He came to the door, and finding it shut, knocked pretty hard, and, as he thought, heard somebody answer within, but was not sure, so he waited, and after some stay knocked again, and then a third time, when he heard somebody coming downstairs. At length the man of the house came to the door. He had on his breeches or drawers, and a yellow flannel waistcoat, no stockings, a pair of slipped shoes, a white cap on his head, and, as the young man said, death in his face. When he opened the door, says he, "What do you disturb me thus for?" The boy, though a little surprised, replied, "I come from such a one, and my master sent me for the money, which he says you know of." "Very well, child," returns the living ghost. "Call as you go by at Cripplegate Church, and bid them ring the bell." And with these words shut the door again, and went up again, and died the same day, nay, perhaps the same hour. This the young man told me himself, and I have reason to believe it. This was while the plague was not come to a height. I think it was in June, towards the latter end of the month. It must be before the dead carts came about, and while they used the ceremony of ringing the bell for the dead, which was over for certain, in that parish at least, before the month of July. For by the 25th of July there died 550 and upwards in a week, and then they could no more bury in form, rich or poor. I have mentioned above that, notwithstanding this dreadful calamity, yet the numbers of thieves were abroad upon all occasions, where they had found any prey, and that these were, generally, women. It was one morning about 11 o'clock. I had walked out to my brother's house in Coleman Street parish, as I often did, to see that all was safe. My brother's house had a little court before it, and a brick wall and a gate in it, and within that several warehouses where his goods of several sorts lay. It happened that in one of those warehouses were several packs of women's high-crowned hats, which came out of the country and were, I suppose, for exportation, whither I know not. I was surprised that when I came near my brother's door, which was in a place they called Swan Alley, I met 3 or 4 women with high-crowned hats on their heads, and as I remembered afterwards, one, if not more, had some hats likewise in their hands. But as I did not see them come out of my brother's door, and not knowing that my brother had any such goods in his warehouse, I did not offer to say anything to them, but went across the way to shun meeting them, as was usual to do at that time, for fear of the plague. But when I came nearer to the gate, I met another woman with more hats come out of the gate. "What business, mistress?" said I. "Have you had there?" "There are more people there," said she. "I have had no more business here than they." Well, I was hasty to get to the gate then, and said no more to her, by which means she got away. But just as I came to the gate, I saw 2 more coming across the yard to come out with hats also on their heads and under their arms, at which I threw the gate to behind me, which having a spring lock fastened itself, and turning to the women, "Forsooth," said I, "what are you doing here?" and seized upon the hats, and took them from them. One of them, who I confessed did not look like a thief, "Indeed," says she, "we are wrong, but we were told they were goods that had no owner. Be pleased to take them again, and look yonder, there are more such customers as we." She cried and looked pitifully, so I took the hats from her, and opened the gate, and bade them be gone, for I pitied the women indeed. But when I looked towards the warehouse, as she directed, there were 6 or 7 more, all women, fitting themselves with hats as unconcerned and quiet as if they had been at a hatter shop buying for their money. I was surprised, not at the sight of so many thieves only, but at the circumstances I was in, being now to thrust myself in among so many people who for some weeks had been so shy of myself that if I met anybody in the street I would cross the way from them. They were equally surprised, though on another account. They all told me they were neighbours, that they had heard any one might take them, that they were nobody's goods and the like. I talked big to them at first, went back to the gate and took out the key so that they were all my prisoners, threatened to lock them all into the warehouse and go and fetch my Lord Mayor's officers for them. They begged heartily, protested they found the gate open and the warehouse door open, and that it had no doubt been broken open by some who expected to find goods of greater value, which indeed was reasonable to believe, because the lock was broke and a padlock that hung to the door on the outside also loose, and not abundance of hats carried away. At length I considered that this was not a time to be cruel and rigorous, and besides that it would necessarily oblige me to go much about, to have several people come to me, and I go to several whose circumstances of health I knew nothing of, and that even at this time the plague was so high as that there died 4,000 a week, so that in showing my resentment, or even in seeking justice for my brother's goods, I might lose my own life. So I contented myself with taking the names and places where some of them lived, who were really inhabitants in the neighbourhood, and threatening that my brother should call them to an account for it when he returned to his habitation. Then I talked a little upon another foot with them, and asked them how they could do such things as these in a time of such general calamity, and, as it were, in the face of God's most dreadful judgments, when the plague was at their very doors, and it may be in their very houses, and they did not know but that the dead cart might stop at their doors in a few hours to carry them to their graves. I could not perceive that my discourse made much impression upon them all that while, until it happened that there came 2 men of the neighbourhood, hearing of the disturbance, and knowing my brother, for they had both dependents upon his family, and they came to my assistance. These being, as I said, neighbours, presently knew 3 of the women, and told me who they were and where they lived, and it seems they had given me a true account of themselves before. This brings these 2 men to a further remembrance. The name of one was John Hayward, who was at that time under-sexton of the parish of St. Stephen, Coleman Street. By under-sexton was understood at that time gravedigger and bearer of the dead. This man carried, or assisted to carry, all the dead to their graves which are buried in that large parish, and who were carried in form, and after that form of burying was stopped, went with the dead cart and the bell to fetch the dead bodies from the houses where they lay, and fetched many of them out of the chambers and houses. For the parish was, and is still, remarkable, particularly above all the parishes in London, for a great number of alleys and thoroughfares, very long, into which no carts could come, and where they were obliged to go and fetch the bodies a very long way, which alleys now remain to witness it, such as White's Alley, Cross Key Court, Swan Alley, Bell Alley, White Horse Alley, and many more. Here they went with a kind of hand-barrow, and laid the bodies on it and carried them out to the carts, which work he performed and never had the distemper at all, but lived about 20 years after it, and was sexton of the parish to the time of his death. His wife at the same time was a nurse to infected people, and tended many that died in the parish, being for her honesty recommended by the parish offices, yet she never was infected either. He never used any preservative against the infection other than holding garlic and rue in his mouth and smoking tobacco. This I also had from his own mouth. And his wife's remedy was washing her head in vinegar, and sprinkling her head clothes so with vinegar as to keep them always moist, and if the smell of any of those she waited on was more than ordinary offensive, she stuffed vinegar up her nose, and sprinkled vinegar upon her head clothes, and held a handkerchief wetted with vinegar to her mouth. It must be confessed that though the plague was chiefly among the poor, yet were the poor the most venturous and fearless of it, and went about their employment with a sort of brutal courage. I must call it so, for it was founded neither on religion nor prudence. Scarce did they use any caution, but ran into any business which they could get employment in, though it was the most hazardous. Such was that of tending the sick, watching houses shut up, carrying infected persons to the pest house, and, which was still worse, carrying the dead away to their graves. It was under this John Hayward's care, and within his bounds, that the story of the piper, with which people have made themselves so merry, happened, and he assured me that it was true. It is said that it was a blind piper, but as John told me, the fellow was not blind, but an ignorant, weak, poor man, and usually walked his rounds about 10 o'clock at night, and went piping along from door to door, and the people usually took him in at public houses where they knew him, and would give him drink and victuals, and sometimes farthings, and he in return would pipe and sing and talk simply, which diverted the people, and thus he lived. It was but a very bad time for this diversion, while things were as I have told, yet the poor fellow went about as usual, but was almost starved, and when anybody asked how he did, he would answer, the dead cart had not taken him yet, but they'd promised to call for him next week. It happened one night that this poor fellow, whether somebody had given him too much drink or no, John Hayward said he had not drink in his house, but that they had given him a little more victuals than ordinary at a public house in Coleman Street, and the poor fellow, having not usually had a bellyful for perhaps not a good while, was laid all along upon the top of a bulk or stall, and fast asleep at a door in the street near London Wall towards Cripplegate, and that upon the same bulk or stall the people of some house, in the alley of which the house was a corner, hearing a bell, which they always rang before the cart came, had laid out a body, really dead of the plague, just by him, thinking too that this poor fellow had been a dead body, as the other was, and laid there by some of the neighbours. Accordingly, when John Hayward with his bell and the cart came along, finding 2 dead bodies lie upon the stall, they took them up with the instrument they used, and threw them into the cart, and all this while the piper slept soundly. From hence they passed along and took in other dead bodies, till, as honest John Hayward told me, they almost buried him alive in the cart. Yet all this while he slept soundly. At length the cart came to the place where the bodies were to be thrown into the ground, which, as I do remember, was at Mount Mill. And as the cart usually stopped some time before they were ready to shoot out the melancholy load they had in it, as soon as the cart stopped, the fellow awaked, and struggled a little to get his head out from among the dead bodies, when, raising himself up in the cart, he called out, "Hey, where am I?" This frighted the fellow that attended about the work, but after some pause, John Hayward, recovering himself, said, "Lord bless us, there's somebody in the cart not quite dead." So another called to him and said, "Who are you?" The fellow answered, "I am the poor piper, where am I?" "Where are you?" says Hayward. "Why, you're in the dead cart, and we are going to bury you." "But I ain't dead though, am I?" says the piper, which made them laugh a little, though, as John said, they were heartily frightened at first. So they helped the poor fellow down, and he went about his business. I know the story goes he set up his pipes in the cart and frightened the bearers and others so that they ran away, but John Hayward did not tell the story so, nor say anything of his piping at all. But that he was a poor piper, and that he was carried away as above, I am fully satisfied as the truth of. Ah, what a lovely story to end on. So, yes, there we go. What a roller coaster of emotions that was. Yesterday's video I will put there, and indeed have done by the time you've watched this. Tomorrow's will go up there. Thank you very much for attending. Thank you also for everyone who's commented and shared and liked and all that. It's very, very nice. I hope you're all doing tremendously. Bye-bye.